There are stories that begin with light, and there are also stories that only originate from the darkness of despair. This is one of them. The world where humans exist in the manhwa resetting the dungeon is no longer peaceful since the appearance of void gates. Called dungeons, these dark holes connect the human world to a strange reality, where monsters, magic, and harsh laws reign. Each dungeon is a mysterious labyrinth, and also a place to store treasures, resources, and opportunities to become heroes. Human society has changed since the day dungeons appeared. The strong, cold hunters became the pillars to protect the city, and also the new rulers. Those who have strength will have it all: money, power, fame, and even fear. On the contrary, the weak are just a burden left behind, despised, crushed in the harsh cycle of survival. The main character of the story, Cain, is one of those people. With no lineage, no talent, no special skills, Cain is just a low-ranking hunter in an anonymous party. He joins dungeon hunting parties just to be bait, running ahead of monsters, taking hits, clearing the way for stronger ones. In return, he only receives a few silver coins, enough to live on. To everyone else, Cain is nothing more than a disposable tool. But to Cain, it is the only choice to survive in this dungeon-dominated world. His life, at first glance, seems to have been decided: forever the weak, forever the one being exploited. But in the midst of extreme darkness, fate prepares an unexpected turn. That day, Cain and his teammates entered a mid-ranking dungeon. For him, this was just a familiar mission: move forward, distract the monsters, then pray that he survives to share the reward. But this time the dungeon was different. The monsters were denser than usual. Not only were they strong, but they also moved in formation as if they had intelligence. Before long, Cain's party fell into chaos. Screams, the sound of metal clashing, and the smell of blood filled the maze. Cain was left behind. The comrades he had trusted, the ones who had promised to protect each other in the moment of danger, all fled, leaving him surrounded. In the dark maze, Cain saw himself gradually being devoured by the monsters. Wounds tore through his body, blood gushing out endlessly. In his final moments, he understood that his life was nothing but a bitter joke. A weakling. No one remembered him when he lived. No one cared when he died. However, as his breath faded, something strange happened. Instead of falling into an eternal nothingness, Cain opened his eyes again, not in the dungeon, but in his shabby room. On the morning of the day he was to embark on the mission, the sun was still warm outside the window. The smell of baking bread from the shop across the street was still fragrant, and the familiar sounds of the market still echoed. Cain was stunned. He remembered death so clearly. He remembered the pain of his blood draining away. But now, his body was intact, without a single wound. Everything seemed to have returned to the starting point. At first, Cain thought it was just a dream, a hallucination caused by the fever of death. But when he stepped out into the street, small events played out exactly as he remembered them. From the greeting of the old vegetable seller to the argument between two drunks, Cain shuddered. This couldn't be a dream. This was a true reset. A feeling of fear and shock took hold of Cain. He had died, but he had come back. He could change everything. He had a chance to right his wrongs, even avoid death. But why? Who gave him this ability, and was it a gift or a curse? Cain had no answer. He only knew that the world before him, cruel and unjust, had now opened a new path. A door of fate had just opened, and he, the one who had been despised, would step through it, whether there was light or darkness ahead. That morning, Cain looked towards the dungeon gate far away on the hill. He clenched his fists. If he could really reset time, then this time he would no longer be prey. This time he would discover a new destiny, a destiny that he himself would decide. After waking up in the dilapidated room, Cain still couldn't believe that what he had just experienced was real. The death was so obvious. The painful feeling was still deeply engraved in his memory. But the reality before his eyes denied everything. With each passing moment, Cain felt a shiver. Every little detail, from the street hawking, the musty smell in the hallway, to the light shining through the crack in the door, was exactly the same as the previous memory. He couldn't deny it. This world had reset, and he was truly alive again. That day, he clearly remembered that the party would enter a mid-level dungeon. That was also the place where he had died the first time. Cain stood still in front of the mirror, looking into his own tired eyes. If this was a second chance, should he continue, or run away, live a normal life? The question swirled in his mind. But then, the image of his teammates abandoning him when surrounded by monsters appeared again, making his heart burn. The humiliation of being despised, the pain of betrayal, all urged him there was no escape. He had to return to the dungeon, but this time it would be different. Cain arrived at the gathering point, where the other members of the team were waiting. They seemed to have not changed at all. Some were laughing and talking arrogantly. Some were lazily sharpening their weapons. All were exactly as they remembered from before. Only Cain carried a heavy mood, because he knew very well the fate of each person. He remembered every death, every scream, every moment of chaos. To him, everything was like a tape he had watched once. As the team entered the dungeon, Cain clearly felt the difference. His heart was pounding, his hands were sweaty. But this time, he was no longer blind. He knew which path led to the trap, knew which dark corners had monsters lurking, and knew in advance when everything would collapse. The anxiety gradually transformed into a strange feeling, the power of someone who had experienced death. Sure enough, the situation repeated itself. Monsters appeared in large numbers, stronger than usual. The party quickly fell into chaos. Last time, Kane had only run away instinctively and was swallowed up. At this time, he tried to use his memories, avoiding the attacks that had killed him, leading the way for his teammates to escape from danger. In an instant, he, the one who had been considered useless, became the one to lead the way. However, the cruel truth remained unchanged. The party still could not withstand the overwhelming power of the monsters. His teammates fled one by one, ignoring Kane's calls for cooperation. Once again, he was left behind, facing the hordes of monsters that were growling towards him. But in the moment of life and death, Kane was no longer afraid like before. He just clenched his blunt sword, screamed madly, and rushed into battle. He knew that he would die, but he wanted to prove one thing. If it really could be reset, then death would no longer be the end. The pain came again, fierce, but this time Kane looked straight at it without hiding. Blood ran down his eyes, his body was torn apart, the monster's screams mixed with his own. Then the night swallowed everything. Kane opened his eyes, he jerked awake, gasping, sweating profusely. The familiar old dilapidated ceiling appeared before his eyes. The inn was still the same. The morning light still shone through the crack in the door. Everything was reversed again. For the second time, he was back to the time before the dungeon began. It's really possible to go back, Kane whispered, both terrified and excited. Death was no longer the end, it was just another beginning. Every time he fell, he would return, bringing with him memories and experiences. This ability, no matter how it appeared, was his chance to change his fate. In the following days, Kane continued to experiment. He entered the dungeon again, fought again, fell again, and woke up again. Each time he died, he learned something: how to avoid the monsters' attacks, the locations of the trap rooms, the weaknesses in their formations. He began to realize that the dungeon was not exactly the same after each reset. There were small changes, strange transformations that he had never seen before. It was as if the dungeon was recognizing his abnormality and adjusting itself. Kane gradually understood. The reset ability was not just a gift, but also a dangerous game. Each time he returned, the dungeon became more unpredictable. The monsters not only grew stronger, but also smarter. Once, he discovered a monster whose previous memories did not exist at all. It was as if the dungeon was trying to test him, to push him further, or bury him forever in the loop. Despite this, Kane did not back down. His fear gradually turned into desire. He wanted to get to the bottom of this secret, why he had the ability to reset, who had arranged the loop, and most importantly, what kind of new destiny he had been promised to have. In the dim light of his rented room, Kane sat alone, looking out at the night sky. Hundreds of unanswered questions swirled in his mind, but he was determined. Each death was a step forward, and each reset was a new opportunity. If this was the path that fate had forced him to take, then he would continue, no longer afraid. Because this time, he was no longer the prey in the dungeon. This time, he would hunt his own fate. Kane died many times, each time in pain, each time in despair, but he still came back. At first, the resurrection confused him, thinking it was just a terrible joke of fate. But after a series of loops, he began to realize something strange. He not only came back to life, but also became stronger with each death. On his fifth return, Kane discovered that the memories and feelings from the battles did not disappear. His body remembered how to dodge attacks, his hands automatically moved more precisely, his reflexes became faster. Although his skills did not change according to the leveling system like in games. Each wound, each blow, each death trained him to become sharper. One morning, when Kane tried swinging his old blunt sword in his rented room, he realized that his movements were completely different. Before, he had only known how to slash randomly like an amateur soldier. Now, every move had rhythm, every turn had precise force. He stopped, panting, his hands shaking. I really improved. Not only his fighting skills, Kane's memory had also been sharpened. He remembered every tunnel in the dungeon, every room with hidden traps, even the fleeting expressions of his teammates before they fled. Everything was like a book that had been flipped through many times, and now he knew every detail by heart. That helped him predict the developments, turning chaos into an advantage for himself. In another reset, Kane decided to try something reckless. Instead of running away like before, he put all his strength into confronting the giant hammer-wielding monster, the one that had crushed him in his third death. The battle was intense. The hammer blows were as heavy as hammers. Each time they hit the ground, the entire maze shook. But Kane was different. He remembered the rhythm of its attacks, remembered the moment when the monster would reveal its flank, and when that moment came, he dodged, delivering a precise slash into the gap of its soft armor. Blood splattered, the monster roared and fell, leaving Kane gasping for air, but alive. The feeling made his heart pound. For the first time in his life, he was not the one running away, not the prey. He had killed a monster many times stronger than himself, thanks to the memories of his previous deaths. But along with the excitement, Kane also realized something terrifying. After the monster fell, the dungeon seemed to change. The walls trembled, ghostly light poured out from the cracks in the rocks, and for a moment, he felt an invisible gaze following him. Something, not human, was watching his every move. The dungeon seemed no longer just a maze of death, but an entity with its own will. Could it be? The dungeon itself is resetting with me, Kane whispered as he returned from another death. The thought made him shudder. If the dungeon had intelligence, then each loop would be like a chess game in which he was playing with an unknown person. However, Kane did not falter. The more danger he faced, the more he wanted to discover the secret behind it. He began to experiment on purpose. One time he did not enter the dungeon, but tried to live a normal day to see if the loop would be broken. But the result was that night, a dark light swallowed him, and when he opened his eyes, he returned to the familiar morning. Apparently, the loop only ended when he entered the dungeon. It did not allow him to escape. Kane also tried to change his decision slightly, taking a different path, talking differently to his teammates, even warning them about the traps in advance. But the outcome was the same. The dungeon somehow dragged him into the tragedy, forcing him to die and reset. He realized the loop not only remembered him but also wanted to challenge him. After dozens of deaths and resurrections, Kane gradually accumulated a huge amount of experience. His body became more flexible, his spirit became steadfast, his fighting skills became more proficient. No longer a low-ranking soldier, Kane was now strong enough to confront the strong people in the party, even surpassing them. One night, after waking up from his 15th death, Kane sat motionless in a dark room. His eyes shone with determination. He understood that this ability was not by chance. Someone or something had chosen him. It could be a dungeon, it could be a mysterious force, or it could be fate itself. But Kane did not care. What mattered was that now, he held in his hands an opportunity that no one else had, the chance to break the chains of fate. He thought to himself, if every death is a lesson, then I will learn until there is nothing left to learn. If the dungeon wants to challenge me, I will defeat it. And if this is the path to a new destiny, I will be the one to rewrite my own story. Outside, the moon was shining brightly in the sky. The wind blew through the crack in the door, carrying a chill as if reminding him that tomorrow the dungeon was still waiting. But this time, Kane was no longer the lamb walking into the wolf's mouth. This time, he would be the hunter. Kane died many times. Each time he returned, he was stronger, faster, and more confident. But as he grew, the dungeon also changed. At first he thought he was just using the loop to improve himself. But gradually, a terrifying truth emerged. The dungeon was also learning from him. In the first loops, the monsters moved instinctively, predictably, and easily avoided. But later on they began to behave strangely. A goblin that used to charge straight ahead now knew how to circle behind him. A pack of wolves that used to move separately now knew how to coordinate into a formation. The climax was when Kane encountered the giant hammer-wielding monster again. The last time he found its weakness and defeated it. But the next time he met it, it had changed its moves, no longer showing the same weakness. Kane died that time, not because of carelessness, but because the dungeon had learned how to counter him. This made Kane understand that he was not only fighting for survival, but also confronting an invisible enemy, an intelligence hidden behind the stone walls of the dungeon. It watched him, adjusted, and then presented new challenges. Each reset, the game became more difficult. In another loop, Kane decided to try to separate from the party and take a turn he had never taken before. The path was dark, cold, and the walls were covered in green moss. It seemed safe at first, but as he went deeper, the entire corridor suddenly shook. From the darkness a giant monster that had never appeared before crawled out, a giant spider with glowing red eyes. Death was swift and terrible. But more importantly, Kane realized that the dungeon was not static. It could change its structure to adapt to his decisions. After each respawn he began to memorize and analyze more carefully, not just the map of the labyrinth, but also the way the dungeon changed. Every choice, every action he made seemed to trigger different transformations. Sometimes it was a new monster. Sometimes it was a surprise trap. Even an earlier betrayal from his teammates. The dungeon not only tested his physical strength and skills, but also wanted to crush his spirit with uncertainty. Once Kane discovered something even more horrifying, the dungeon began to whisper to him. While lost in the thick darkness, he heard faint whispers, as if coming from underground. You cannot escape. You are just a puppet. The voice was vague, unknown to whom it belonged, but so cold that it gave Kane goosebumps. And when he was killed shortly after, before his consciousness faded, he could still hear a soft laugh ringing in his head. When he returned to his room, Kane sat motionless for a long time. The previous loops had only made him see the dungeon as a soulless mechanism, a giant trap. But now it was different. It could talk. It wanted him to know that he was being watched, that he was being tested. The dungeon was not just a battlefield, it was a real opponent. However, instead of being afraid, Kane became even more determined. He told himself, if the dungeon treats me like a game, then I will break that game. If it wants to turn me into a puppet, then I will break the strings that bind me. In the following times, Cain changed his approach. He no longer just tried to survive, but began to search for traces of the dungeon controller. In a deep corner of the maze, he discovered strange symbols carved on the wall. They emitted a dim light, trembling as if alive. When he touched them, Cain felt a strange energy flow through him, accompanied by a flash of an image in his mind. A door, tall and dark, sealed with iron chains. Cain jerked his hand back in surprise. The image disappeared, but he knew for sure that it was not an illusion. It was a fragment of the dungeon's memory, a hint that there was a greater secret behind the challenges. From then on, he didn't just focus on fighting. Every time he looped, he tried to follow a different path, looking for more symbols. Once, he even heard whispers echoing from them, like fragments of a buried story. Those fragments mentioned a master, a person who fell into the loop before you. That sentence made Cain shiver. Was he not the only one who had been swallowed by the dungeon in this game? The challenges became more and more intense, but along with that, Cain got closer to the truth. He realized that the dungeon was not simply a place to challenge resources. It was a living being, or worse, a giant machine built by someone with a specific purpose. And by resetting, Cain was stepping deeper into a dangerous game that he had no idea about at first. Still, a fire burned in his eyes. If someone wanted to make him a puppet, then he would be the one to break the game. Every time he died, he learned more. Every time he looped, he grew stronger. The more the dungeon changed, the more he yearned to overcome it. And deep down, Cain believed the key to a new destiny lay at the heart of the dungeon where the true secret was hidden. The successive resets have taken him further than ever. From a lost, abandoned person in the dungeon, he is now able to confidently face challenges alone that once terrified an entire team. However, the deeper he goes into the reset chain, the more he realizes that the power he has is not simply to kill monsters. There is something hidden beyond the familiar loops. It is like an invisible hand, patiently guiding him to another destiny. One night, after escaping from a mid-level dungeon that he never dared to enter before, the protagonist sits silently in a small rented room. The wounds on his body throbbed, but what bothered him was not the pain, but the memories. In his mind, dozens of memories from his deaths overlapped, appearing like fragments of a broken mirror. There were scenes of him dying under the claws of beasts, times when he was betrayed by his own teammates, and times when he lost his life because of a small mistake. But strangely, all those memories did not make him despair, but rather, like pieces of a puzzle that were gradually forming a complete picture. He began to write down every detail he remembered. The small changes in the dungeon every time he reset, the strange figures appearing where no NPC should have existed, the whispers that rang out when he was close to death. The more he wrote, the more he shivered. It seemed like there was another rule controlling the entire loop. Dungeons were not just challenges, but also a mechanism to imprison or test someone. And that person was him. Another time, when he entered the depths of the dungeon, he encountered an unprecedented phenomenon. A large door covered in ancient symbols. This door was not on any map, and in previous resets, he had never seen it appear. It was as if the number of deaths and resets had opened a new branch of fate, one reserved for him alone. When he touched the door, he heard a vague voice echoing the one who carries the cycle. You are not a failure. You are the missing piece to break the chains of this world. That whisper haunted him for days. It made him realize the truth. He had not just accidentally received the reset ability, but had been chosen. Someone, or some force, had arranged for him to walk on this path. After that time, he began to notice changes in the dungeon. Monsters no longer moved in the same orbit. They appeared as if they knew his actions in advance, sometimes even arrayed themselves as if they had human intelligence. There was even a leader who directly called out to him, which was completely unreasonable, because how could a monster in the dungeon remember previous resets? His suspicion grew. He began to wonder, was he not the only one who kept his memories through each reset? Were there other creatures, or even humans, trapped in this loop, sharing the same spiral fate with him? The deeper he went, the more he felt himself being pulled toward an invisible center, where all the loops converged. He was no longer simply a dungeon hunter seeking power, but a seeker of truth. Then the decisive moment came. In a high-level dungeon, after overcoming a series of enemies, he faced a giant entity, a knight in black armor, emitting a dark aura. As his swords clashed, the knight whispered, "You have finally come, the chosen one of the loop." The battle was fierce, but in the midst of life and death, he suddenly remembered the hundreds of deaths he had before. Every wound, every mistake, every piled-up memory of death crystallized into an absolute fighting instinct. He struck the decisive blow, defeating the knight. However, instead of dissolving like all the other bosses, the knight smiled, then turned into a particle of light, leaving a glowing crystal in his hand. The crystal had an inscription: "Your destiny is not to survive. Your destiny is to choose, to maintain the loop to preserve the world, or to break it and find a new path." At this moment, he understood that everything he had experienced was just the beginning. Dungeons, loops, resets, all were tools of testing to prepare for the final decision. His new destiny was no longer limited to changing himself, but to deciding the fate of the entire world. He left the dungeon that day with trembling hands. But there was a completely different light in his eyes, the light of someone who had seen a new horizon. From now on, he was no longer simply a survivor thanks to resets. He became the chosen one, the one who could reshape the entire order of the dungeon and the fate of humanity. The story from here is no longer a journey of revenge or a search for power. It has become a confrontation with the invisible chain that binds the world, and he knows that the road ahead will not only have monsters, not only betrayed teammates, but also others. Also chosen, also with the power of the loop, but can stand on the opposing side. A new destiny was revealed. And from that moment on, his journey was no longer the story of one man, but a battle to decide the future of all.